Hello, everyone. It's me, Andrew. I'm here at Star Cottage Studio. If you saw earlier, we did a tour of Star Cottage Studio, just a quick one. And I mentioned that I was going to come back on and do a polymer clay tutorial. So if you didn't know, it's our takeover day in the Great Bead Extravaganza, and we've been posting all day about our business so that people can get to know us and what we do here at Allegory Gallery. And currently we have a sale going on in the online store. That's at allegorygallery.com. And the coupon code for that is takeover, I believe. You'll have to double check the posts in the group to make sure, because I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, so we are working on doing that and posting today. We have until midnight our time to post here. So I thought that we should do something fun and make something. We usually do these tutorials on Tuesdays. Usually that's my day that I'm in, and we've started doing recently make-alongs virtually over Zoom so that people who aren't around can still hang out and make things. It's not the same as being in person, but it's a close second. And plus we get to see folks from all over. It's been a little bit rough today, I'll be honest with you, for many different reasons. Yeah, so the biggest reason is that our cat recently passed away, and we were both very sad about it. And I'm going to try not to break down on camera because nobody wants to see me snorching on camera. But yeah, so there's been a lot of things going on behind the scenes, some good, some bad, but anyway, so I thought that since we've kind of dedicated this day to Babette, that I should do, honor her a little bit by making a little figurine of her. And so I thought we would do that today. All right, so I'm going to flip this around and we will get going. And then you don't have to stare at my face anymore, all right? So I'm going to apologize in advance because I have stress-induced eczema. And so I've been breaking out pretty bad, and it has been focusing on my hands. So I've been trying to get them so that they don't look too terrible, but I'm not going to get too much into it, but there's like patches and stuff on my cuticles and on my wrists, which is not delightful. And I don't love that, but I thought I would mention it before anybody else did to kind of like preventively stem the tides or whatever. So for today's project, we're going to need some kind of tile, a baking tile. This is just a tile that you can get at any home improvement store. You have to make sure that if you get a tile that it will fit in your toaster oven. Speaking of toaster ovens, I have a dedicated toaster oven for my polymer clay stuff. If I do bigger things, I will use my home oven. But if I do, I like to tent my work, especially if it's large, because it will off gas and your house will smell very strongly of baked polymer clay. And although it's relatively safe, this is a product that came out in the 60s or so. And if there was any kind of serious adverse effects, we would all know about them by now. But so far, it's relatively safe. But with that said, some people are sensitive. If you are sensitive to it, make sure that you have a well ventilated area, or you have a friend bake your stuff, or whatever. But or pick a different medium to work with, because like with all things, this is basically you have to be careful with what you do. Um, even harmless, supposedly harmless things can lead to problems. So you don't want to have problems. And yeah, so make sure to take every safety precaution that you can, so that you kind of extend your crafting life as long as possible. All right, so the next thing that we're going to need is some, hopefully I don't spill this everywhere, which I kind of just did, is some aluminum foil. And we're going to use the aluminum foil to make an armature. So when you are sculpting or drawing or whatever, I always suggest people work from the general and go specific. So if you're going to, for example, draw a hand, you start off with a general shape, and it may look like a mitten at first, but then you block in your points of where you are going to work, and then flesh out the detail. That's how I teach sculpting, and that's how I teach drawing. But you start with rough forms and gestural movements, and then you narrow your focus in deeper and deeper and get more details. All right. So here you go. This looks like a baked potato, right? And I'm just going to compress this down into a rough cat shape. Now, another thing I recommend is if you are trying to duplicate something exactly, then you should definitely use reference materials. A lot of times I hear people say, "Oh, I can't draw, I can't draw, I can't draw," or "I can't sculpt, I can't sculpt." And then I ask them what they're working from, and they're like, "Oh, well, from my imagination." Um, and while that is an admirable quality, if you can do it, generally, most of the professional artists that I know struggle with that and need to have references anyway. And whether or not you stick to that reference completely, or if you freestyle, at least you have a basis so that things are right-ish, or at least appear right. So if you're going to do something like super anatomical, like a person, it's super good to have those little wooden mannequins, those posable mannequins that you can kind of adjust or have somebody sit for you or take pictures. But it's good to have that as a reference guide. Of course, you can always just do it by feeling, and you get what you get. So I've made this into a rough cat shape, and you're like, what? That doesn't look like anything. That looks strangely obscene. But it is exactly the level of detail that I need. And if I need to do anything to adjust it, I can always smash it and compress it. Aluminum foil, it has we don't want to compress it too hard, because we want to keep some of that air in there, so that so that we don't get rid of all the volume. But also, if we make this too smooth, it doesn't really have a way of gripping into your armature, and you want to make sure that you have something that's going to grip into it. If you are going to do something that is more willowy, you can use a wire armature. Just make sure that the armature that you use is something that you can heat. So if you I don't know what you would use that you can't heat. But if you're going to use like, I don't know, something that's temperature sensitive, like maybe friendly plastic or something like that, where it's temperature sensitive. If you make your armature out of that and it's like stood up and it's all thin and you have clay on top of that, it's just going to wilt over, kind of like a sad flower. So you don't want to have this sad flower sculpture, or maybe you do. I don't know. Maybe you're a real big fan of Salvador Dali and you're like, oh, I really want to have that melted over look. Then by all means, have at it. But if you want to have something that is more sturdy, use things like a wire or aluminum foil. You can use wood, but that can kind of get weird sometimes, because sometimes wood has moisture in it and air, and it can cause things to expand, especially if you coat the thing in the whole entire all the way around. So just be careful and mindful of that. You can definitely try it out. I would not recommend anything like styrofoam unless it is graded for heat, because it can collapse in on itself. And then you work on this building up an armature and then it just like smushes. So don't do that. You want to use something that's going to be sturdy. This is aluminum foil is relatively inexpensive and widely available. So, if it works, it works, right? Um, for the clay that I like to use, I like to make a mixture of Super Sculpey and Primo White, depending on what you're doing, or what I'm doing rather. I use a little bit of glitter on this one on accident. So it's a little bit shiny and a little bit extra crumbly. So yeah. Cynthia asked, what are you making? I'm going to make a little cat sculpture. So you want to make sure that your clay um, is well conditioned. And what that means is sometimes when you leave clay for a while, it gets super brittle like this. And this is not ideal. This causes cracking and there's all kinds of stuff. And what happens is that emulsifiers or the plasticizers in the clay are not evenly distributed throughout the clay. So it's like the juicy part goes in the middle, and then the outside is dry, and then you'll have problems where you'll be trying to do something and it won't work out. So just be mindful to condition the clay. I should have done this before I was on camera, because it is a kind of a kneading process. You have to knead it. Also, I like working on a tile because it's not going to get on the wood. Sometimes if you work with polymer clay on wood, it can mess up your wood surfaces. And plastic, if it's not a rated plastic to be working with polymer, the polymer can actually kind of eat away the plastic. So just be mindful of that. I noticed like I had some liquid polymer on plastic. I can't remember what it was exactly. It was probably like a lid or something. And the liquid polymer started dissolving the plastic. So just be careful of that. And I mean, these little tiles, they cost almost nothing. and so maybe like $1. So that's no problem. And they come in big sheets if you need a bigger sheet. Sometimes when I'm working on an assembly line, I have this thick plate glass that I'll put on a table, and it makes a perfectly smooth surface. If not, you can just tape down wax paper or something like that so that you are not in direct contact with your surface. Sometimes, you don't want necessarily stuff to get into your, you don't want to have it, uh, you don't want that to like make your table feel like it's been used with polymer. Sometimes, like your hands, if you work with polymer a lot, it can kind of feel like there's a film. Generally speaking, what I do when um, when I am not, on camera, is I have a motorized pasta machine and I will run it through, 20, 30 times so that when it's all uniform, it's all one color. And also, what happens is when you roll it out, you won't get these crinkly edges. If you roll it out and there's a crinkly edge, generally speaking, that means that there are too many inclusions. So if you got like wild with adding sparkle dust and different things like that, that can make your clay kind of have a ragged edge. And number two, it can mean that the plasticizers aren't worked all the way through the clay. And so you want to make sure that when you roll this out, it makes a smooth line, and that will be your guide to let you know that it has been fully conditioned. Now, I see there's a couple different comments. Bonnie says, "Good tip to mix. I've had so much trouble with polymer getting hard after baking." Um, I don't. Uh, you you will want your polymer clay to get hard after baking. That that's uh, that's what you want it to happen. However, uh, like if you get old clay, you some of the old recipes of the clay were a little bit better, I think, in my opinion, where they had more plasticizers in it. I don't know, but it seemed to last longer. Some of the newer clays get a little bit, they seem to dry out a lot quicker. Now, if your clay dries out, you can add what's called clay conditioner, and it's basically an alcohol that helps break it down a little bit to get it more workable. Now you can also put liquid polymer in to kind of rejuvenate it. However, it can get very messy. So just be mindful of that. Sometimes I do that if I want to soften the clay up. I made a huge mistake today. I've been noticeably distracted, so it's not a huge surprise that I would mess up. But I left my polymer clay in the car while I was doing the store tour, and it was hot. So I'm just hoping that the heat from the car didn't inadvertently bake the clay, because that can happen and it has happened. Um, I remember going on a trip once and we went into this art supply store, and it was a really great art supply store, and I got some polymer, and I put it in a bag, and whatever. And when we went around, did some walking and touring and eating at places, and I didn't bring that bag with me. And so it was in the car, and it had basically baked inside of the car. So that is not a good uh, thing. You want to make sure that your clay is workable and smoothly has a plasticity to it, and it will do that. Now, as far as mixing the clays, the reason why I like to mix my clay is I like what happens. Sometimes you can't mix clays. Not all clays like to work together. You should keep that in mind, because some of the the recipes of the clay just don't work. So sometimes if you mix, Fimo with souffle clay, you can end up with a really brittle clay. Now, there's a bunch of different kind of tests that you can do to get the ratio that you like. I don't like to use like regular Sculpey because I feel like it is too mushy. It's too, it won't hold detail as well, and you're working on stuff, and by the time you get around to adding detail on the other side, half the face is squashed, and it's just not an ideal working medium. However, sometimes clays can be too stiff. So clays like Fimo do not work well for me because I find that you have to condition them a really long time and the clay is really hard. And it's not as malleable. Now, if you're doing cane work, that's great. You need something that's going to hold its shape. However, I do not like to have to like condition for 5 hours, which I'm basically doing now on camera. But normally I would just put this in the pasta machine and let it go through about 12 or so times and to get it nice and workable. But and then you can just use your clay to pick up anything that may have rolled off. And then, of course, there's like cat hairs and all kinds of stuff embedded in the clay. And that's because this has been in my house, and my house has cat hair. And it's perfect for your cat creation, I guess. All right. Teresa says it is similar to dough. It is easier to work with on a ceramic or marble surfaces. Yeah, I can agree with that. June says mixing two clays makes better workable clay. So it does for me. So my thing is I'll use, okay, so every artist is going to be different according to what they're working on. So if you like, some people really love souffle clays because they are matte and kind of have leather kind of suede kind of like finish to them. However, I think they're kind of crumbly. So I will only use souffle clays to color my clay. Now, also, it depends how old your clay is. Like if you have a fresher clay, your clay will be a lot smoother and it'll be more malleable. Unless it's like super old, and then it won't be. This I've left out, and there's a thing you can do if your clay is too mushy and there's too much of a plasticizer. There's a process that you can do called leaching, and so you take like a piece of paper and you put the piece of polymer clay on it, and it will soak out some of that moisture. Because I've left this out of the wrapper, which you should wrap up your clay, it has inadvertently leached out some of that goodness. So that's on me, yo. Um, Let me get some fresh real fast, and maybe we'll speed things up. Okay, so this clay is straight in the package, and will be, in theory, extra mushy. It's a Super Sculpey 3, so it is a more mushy clay. So I like this if I need it to be mushy, but then I'm adding it to this clay, which is kind of stiff. So you just kind of have to find the right recipe, right? So that you get it so that it's nice and will work well and work smoothly. Um, Michelle said, never use clay. Nice lesson. Thanks. Cynthia says, it's a big chunk of time. I'm generally too lazy to do this, and I always regret it. Yeah, I think it's important to condition the clay and get that right consistency, and your end result will be a lot better. But you can see how this one clay is so much softer and smoother. And if I wasn't on camera, run it through the pasta machine a couple times, and it will condition it so much faster than doing it by hand. I'm actually just I'll wipe down the table later, but I need to. You're gonna hear everything rattling and shaking. But you'll see kind of like the speed demo of me conditioning clay. I guess this is speed considering. So I roll it into kind of stripes, and then we'll roll it again and then roll it back down. And the thing is you don't want a ton of air bubbles in it, because if it gets air bubbles, then that can cause problems too. They can kind of puff up. So you want to avoid that. And when you're working with ceramic clay, it's called wedging. And that's it's a fun technique that you can do. Generally speaking, when you roll this out, and if you see an air bubble, you can take an X-Acto knife or a blade and cut the air bubble, and have that. You can press out that air and just heal it and make it so that it's like it's not even there. All right. Abby says, Cynthia Thornton, same. I often have raggedy edges. So you want to try to skip the raggedy edges, because then you can have cracking in your work. Now, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you can do raggedy edges and it'll be fine, it doesn't always happen. But if the clay is breaking when it's wet like this, it's gonna crack when it's cooked. And sometimes those cracks you'll see right away. And then sometimes they won't happen until the piece cools. And as the piece cools, it will have different expansion rates and kind of crack that way. So, and if you're mixing colors, because right now I'm trying to get all one consistent color. And that's another trick to make sure that your clay is fully conditioned. So one of the things that I like to do to make sure that my clay is perfectly conditioned is I will take two different colors of clay and mix those. And when it's all one seamless color, you know that it's conditioned. If you see stripes and marbling, then you can tell that it's not fully mixed. So you want to make sure that it's fully mixed and that the plasticizers are very well distributed in your clay. Teresa says, I use my pasta machine too for my clay. I love it. It saves a ton of time. And I used to do a ton of polymer clay, and it really saved my hands. So just keep that in mind. It will, it's an investment that will pay for itself. Now, I see a lot of people, sometimes they say that the pasta machines break really fast and they seem to not last very long. And usually when I see people complaining about it, it's because they're not using it properly. So what that means is they try to start off with such a huge chunk and then try to force it in there, and then it breaks over. It breaks pretty quick. So the thing is, if you're going to put it in the pasta machine, you're going to kind of flatten it out, and then so that when you roll it through the pasta machine, it will it won't be so much pressure from something so big to something so small. Also, start with the big settings first and then work your way down until it gets finer, and that helps as well. Now, I've seen a lot of people kind of debate about how you run your pasta machine. Some people say that you should put, when you fold your pieces of clay, you should put the open seam side up so that the air gets pushed down. I've seen where people will put it through there, like this. I don't know why, but I think this traps the air. I feel like this way, if you have this seam up, it will force the air out if there are any air pockets. Now, I'm going to take a quick little break and run this through the pasta machine just so we can speed things up, because otherwise I'm just going to be working this clay, and I would like to get going a little bit quicker. All right. So talk amongst yourself for a second or two. All right, I'm back. All right. So here I rolled this through the pasta machine and it's on the 0 setting, and it kind of is raggedy edge, but it'll be okay. If you see any hairs, don't be afraid to take the tweezers out and you to pick them out. Um, so, like for example, you can see there's a hair in there pretty significantly, and I would just get a needle. Let me see where the needle is. In theory, there was a needle here the other day, and this is, and just pick it out. And that will also help. I mean, if there's something that's trapped in there, it's not the end of the world. But if you can keep your area as clean as possible, then that helps as well. Because sometimes those hairs can cause air bubbles and do all kinds of funky stuff. Now, another thing you should keep in mind is what you're working with. So, if you're working with a white clay, if you work with red clay and then you work with white clay and you think you cleaned up, you'll probably end up with pink clay. So you have to make sure you really wipe down everything and make sure the surfaces are clean. Now, another thing that happens sometimes is if you have those really dark indigo colored jeans and you try to work with white clay, for some reason that picks up every little bit of lint or whatever, and you will see every little smudge of that bluish kind of linty color. So if your intention is to keep things really pristine and light and not have any kind of inclusions. Make sure that you're working in an area that is as dust free as possible and that you're wearing clothing in a corresponding color. And I know that sounds wackadoodle and wild, but I have seen it where somebody has tried to have they mix like a flesh color, but they got lint off their sweater on it, and then you look at the face or whatever, and all you can see is that little bit of lint or that thing where they where it came off the clothing and it shed into the clay. So be mindful of that because it does happen and it can affect the clay and it kind of makes it look dirty. So one way you can get around that, and Christy is kind of the queen of this, but she mixes in, there's a color of clay called granite, and it has little bits and speckles of clay in it already. And it's that kind of mentality. If you can't beat them, join them instead of, if you can't beat them, join them. And that's the kind of idea that if you're in an area that you are going to have inclusions and different things, then be intentional about adding inclusions and then it looks purposeful as opposed to accidental. But again, it's up to you. So I've rolled this clay out on the 0 setting. Teresa says, I always put it in seam side up. You can see the air being released. Yep. And Joyce says, wear an apron. You know what? But sometimes the aprons, they have schmutz on them too. So, you kind of have to roll with it. So if you're working with like dark colored clays, I have a jean apron, and I can guarantee you by the end of it, that white clay will look a little bit less white. Sometimes also you can play with stuff too. Like if you have something that's like the white is kind of like a cream color and you want to make it whiter looking, you can add more white, but the problem is that you can't really take out the yellow. So you can kind of trick the eye by adding just a smidge of blue clay. And that smidge of blue clay is almost like bluing when you're like bluing white shirts, or when they're dyeing somebody's hair like a platinum. Sometimes they'll add a bluing solution so that it doesn't look like it's yellow, kind of that yellow white color. It will look more like a starker white. So if you need to have something super white, you can use a little bit of blue clay into that white, and it will trick the eye into making it look like a cooler white instead of a, a more yellow white, which can kind of look sometimes dingy. Cynthia says, if you don't want any fibers, don't wear anything dark. Yep. I guess you could say that you could work naked, but not unless you're like with other people. And also, I don't know about you, but I have hairs all over my body, so that's also less than desirable. You don't want any. We had a There was a teacher, and when I was in art school, and he says, if I find hairs on your work, you automatically get points deductive. And he would go through a list of hairs, and he's like, if it's short and stubbly, you get this many points off. And he's like, and if it's long and curly, you get even more. So anyways, I thought that was a little bit funny to remember that. Cynthia says, Wendy Froud suggests wearing all white and having a tub of wet naps at your desk. Yes. One thing that Wendy Froud does that I don't necessarily agree with, and this is going to sound like sacrilege because generally I love Wendy Froud. She uses a food processor to mix her clay, and that it works. But the issue that I found is that sometimes, at least in the food process, maybe I need to get a better food processor. But the food processors that I've used in the past, sometimes the friction of the clay and the blades, it can heat the blade up, and it gets to the point where almost it cooks some of the clay as you're working with it. And so I did her method of mixing the clay, and I was picking little bits of cooked clay out of the rest of it. So it would be like, this would be like the smooth sheet, and then I noticed there were these little giblets in the clay, and I kept having to pick those out. So as it was in the food processor, it would get cooked on the blade of the food processor, and then as it cooled, it would then break up as I was working with the clay. So that her technique for mixing that is not one that I do. Or if you do it, just don't do it too much, I guess, and do it sparingly and maybe space it out. I don't know if there's a way to cool the blade while you're working with it, but it's the same thing with like polishing. If you polish something super aggressively, then your piece, like your metal piece, if you polish it super aggressively, your piece will heat up and you can burn yourself. So just be mindful of that. Joyce says food processor, ugh, the cleanup. Yeah, it's not as bad if you have a dedicated food processor, which I would highly recommend. I would highly recommend that, because if you that's not something that means that like I can almost taste the polymer clay in the cooking in my mind just thinking of that. But anyway, so I've made my armature. It's a work of art already. And then I've got my clay and I've rolled this out on a 0 setting. And I'm just going to break off pieces and start covering the surface. And it doesn't even matter what it looks like right now. I'm just covering it, okay? And I'm going to overlap my pieces so that they adhere into themselves. And I may have not made enough clay here. Let's do this. I'll make a smaller sculpture because I feel as though I'm probably not going to have enough clay to cover it. So I'm just gonna compress it. And that's the beautiful thing about the aluminum foil, is that you can kind of compress it down even further. Now you won't want to have to compress it too much, because if you compress it too much, then instead of being a light kind of core, it'll be heavy. So this should be plenty. So you will overlap with your piece, and you're going to cover your entire piece with clay. All right. Now I'm going to reserve some clay off to the side for sculptural details. So I don't want to use all my clay up. If I do need to use more clay, that's no problem. I can add it. But I don't really want to have you to sit and watch me condition clay again. So we're not going to do that. All right, so I've covered this completely. So now what it is all about, I've got my general shape, which looks like a melted snowman at this point. And what I'm going to do is kind of compress this clay into there so it conforms to the surface and really gets in those nooks and crannies and creates a solid kind of surface. You want to make sure that your surface is going to be a solid, complete surface, and that it really grips into your armature so that it's nice and sturdy and strong. And also, the other thing is that you're working out any kind of air bubbles also, because you can see it, like you can see the air bubbles. Like there's an air bubble. You just go in and cut it like that and press it out. Now as we start thinking about more specific, we're going to get into tools. One of my favorite tools is an African porcupine quill, and I know that sounds like super specific, but the reason why is you can't really use American porcupine quills because they're too short, and those are like needles for like if you're gonna like do bead weaving and stuff. If you're gonna do it like the first people's kind of bead weaving, then you would use an American porcupine quill. But for sculpting, you need a little bit more oomph to it. So an African porcupine quill is made of keratin, which is basically like what your nails are made out of. And the thing that I love about the keratin is that it is for one thing, it's a sustainable thing, so you don't have to kill the animal to get it. These are shed naturally, and they can make more and more. So it's not something where you have to kill the animal to get it. Number two, they're lightweight, so so you can work on something for hours and hours and not get hand fatigue. One of the tools that I got is super, super duper heavy, and it has its purposes, but I would never, 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 never use that to sculpt detail for long stretches of time because my hand cramps just thinking of it. So just keep that in mind. Um, Christy, she has a line of tools. Her tools are, that to be 100% honest and transparent, her tools are on the heavier side. So uh, just keep that in mind because if you're going to do stuff with a lot of like precise detail, maybe grab something else. Greg makes a tool that is twisted steel, and sometimes they have those available. Those work really well, and they come in all different tips, just like commercially available ones. If you can't get an African porcupine quill, it feels like you're in Harry Potter and you have to choose a wand kind of situation, but you want one that's going to fit your hand nicely. And the cool thing is that you can take sandpaper and you can sand down the tips of the porcupine quill to be the exact shape and smoothness that you need. And I feel like the more you use that quill, the better and better it gets. So it's not like a one and done thing. Like sometimes, like with some of the more disposable kind of things, people will use a sculpting tool like one time only. But I feel like with porcupine quills, African porcupine quills, they will last a really long time and they just get better and better with the usage. And the reason why I think that is because it's keratin, it has a natural grain structure to it. And the clay over time will fill in that grain structure. And so you'll get this really beautiful kind of finish on your tool. And you could also make them out of wood. But you have to be, you just have to be mindful of 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 that. A lot of times I won't use wood unless I purposely am trying to get a texture from the wood. But you can like just like with the African porcupine quill, you can use that to you can sand it down, and if you need to, you can fill the gaps too. So if you need to, you can put epoxy putty or epoxy clay and use that as a way to fill in if there's a really deep kind of grain structure, you can kind of smooth that over and let that cure and then polish it down really fine and really work that tip or your tool so that it's really perfect and will do what you want it to do. Cynthia says you can get them in bundles on eBay and then use nail files and such to alter them to the shapes that are useful. Yes, you can. Now, where did I put mine? So when I teach and stuff, and I have them do it, I mark mine so that nobody accidentally steals it, because they do look, they kind of all look the same. So with this one, I have a flat end that's tapered and kind of sharp. This is really good for lettering and really fine detail. This is more of like a scooped shape, and that's good for smoothing things down. I have other ones here like this one, and these are super dirty because I was working with a brown clay. And these are almost like points, like pinpoints, and those are good for stippling. Um, and if you want some things that I have in my kind of kit, is I have these polymer clay tissue blades. If your eyesight is not good, make sure to mark which side is the top and safe to use, because the other side is super sharp. And I've seen people, not in classes I've taught, because I stress about how not to bleed on the teacher, but they will put it and they will press it down on there, and then they cut their fingers, and then there's blood everywhere, and then you spend half the class cleaning up blood, and um, you know, you can spend that time working on things instead. And then this one is a little bit more blunt, so and is a little bit less wide as this one. But I have different ones like that. And then, like Cynthia said, is use those nail files and you can polish them up. Um, and sometimes you can get really fine impregnated pieces of cloth that are little squares that they're used for buffing jewelry. And you can use those as well to really get that super smooth and get them absolutely the way you want it. But I do have things like scoops, these dental scoops. I have ceramic tools that I'll use. One of my favorite tools, which I can't see right now, is the one that is just like it's like a pin stuck in a piece of wood, and it's like an awl. And that one is super useful. And the reason why it's not in this kit is probably because I was using it last. But it's so sharp that you just go through. And when I need to make a hole, I just go like this and go like this, and you have a hole. Instead of having to get a straw and then poking it and then peeling it out. But this one is just, you just go like this and it makes a hole, and then just press down the sides. All right. So let's see. Marianne says, would rather not deal with a biohazard. I don't know what that's in regard to, but if you can avoid biohazardous materials, then that's great. If you are sanding or doing any kind of polishing, make sure you wear a mask. We all have probably about 24 of them now. So just so you're not breathing in anything that you're not supposed to. Cynthia says, I use the nail buffers and they will be glassy. Yeah, those are really useful. Cynthia says, you need some tools from Greg. I have one somewhere. It's probably in my stone setting stuff, because sometimes I use his tool to do flesh settings. Um, and then I also bought a bunch of steel in theory because I took a stamp making class and I was going to make some of my own. But yeah, um, that'd be great. I love his tools. They're really pretty as well. Oh, Marion says blood. Yeah, sometimes you don't want to bleed on your stuff. That that especially if you're in a class. I remember I was on the bus one time, and these kids, they were so rowdy and they were always getting into trouble, and they're so loud, and they would sit in the back of the bus, and they were always passing their garbage up. And because you weren't supposed to get up on the school bus, you had to, and they only have the trash can at the front of the bus, so they would always be handing the garbage for us near the middle and the front of the bus to put in the garbage can. Anyways, one of my and sometimes it'd be gross stuff too, like a used tissue, and you're like, I wonder where how COVID spread, and like, well, they didn't have COVID back then, at least like not how they have it now, but that's probably half the kids on the bus got the cold or whatever from that. But anyways, one time my we were sitting towards the back of the bus, and one of my friends, she got a bloody nose, and it um just started gushing blood. And so she had tissues in her pocket, and she dabbed it, and they were like drenched. It was not like a little dot of blood. It was like the whole rag was like soaked with it. And and so she went, and she acted like she's gonna pass the bloody paper towel up, and the girl's face that she was at look she at first she wasn't looking real super close, so she went to reach for what Susan was handing her, and then she saw the blood, and she recoiled in shock and terror, and it was like the perfect revenge for all those many times that we had to handle their questionable garbage. She didn't actually hand her the bloody rag, but I laughed myself hoarse, and in the whole ride I just laughed and laughed and laughed, and it was that was wonderful. Anyways, so what I'm doing now is, again, this is just a general shape, and then I'm going to move specific. So one thing that you'll notice about like a cat silhouette is the ears. So make a ball of clay, squash the ball of clay, and then pinch that clay so that it's a little bit like a little teardrop. Then you take that and you will push this from the back and smooth it. And then you'll do it from the front. And that will make sure that there's a nice adhesion to it. And it's helpful to make your balls the same size if possible. That way you don't have like one ear is like super big and then the other one is like super small. So if you measure out your balls in advance, you can make sure that they're relatively the same size. And so your ears will be the same size. So I'm just smoothing it. Wherever there's a seam, I'm going to smooth it. And I'm not being too particularly precious with this because I am still early stage of this. All right. So when you think of a cat, then you think of the eyes, and then you'll think of the little muzzle. So to get the muzzle to pop, you will want to compress where the neck is. And you will add some clay too. So you can work on that by making a ball and adding that. All right. And then with all things, you kind of smooth it down so that you build up that form there. All right. And like I said, it does help to have reference, but I've been staring at lots of cat pictures, particularly of Miss Babette lately, so I don't need it. All right. So I've got these little taxidermy eyes. I think these were originally for some kind of reptilian creature, but I kind of liked that they were green. Whoop, I just flipped that on the floor. But they work. They're like nondescript. My grandma used to have a cat sculpture and it had eyes like these, and the rest of it was kind of painted ceramic, and the eyes were glass. And so it looked like its eyes would kind of glow. Thankfully, it did not go underneath the oven because that would have been not great. So you place the eyes and press them in. And I'm going to make the slits go vertically. And what I do is I make these little coils. Whoop. Well, actually, what I'm going to do first, before I get into any of this detail business, I'm going to flesh out some of the paws and stuff. So I'm just going to roll out some clay, and then I'm going to press this. So this will be the arms, and this will be the arms, and this will be the chest. Sometimes if you need to, you can kind of draw on your clay too, if you need to. And then that will kind of give you a guidepost to show you where you need to go. Now, if you get a point where your aluminum foil sticks out like this, Joy says, so you can bake with the eyes in. Yes, they're glass, so they won't melt. Glass won't melt, and that's what they use for like taxidermy. And these are taxidermy eyes. So um, sometimes the plastic ones, you can get away with it, but sometimes you can't. So if your aluminum foil from your armature pokes out through the clay like this, I'm purposely holding the head off camera in case anybody's wondering. If it does poke out like this, you can take a tool and stab it back in and press that aluminum foil so that it hides underneath the clay. And then you just take some more clay and smooth it over. But this is how you build up those forms, is you start blocking out the arms and the chest and the body. And Babette, before she died, she was a very fluffy cat. And so, and we called her the cotton paw cat because she had bright white cotton paws. And so um, sometimes it would look like she's all just a black, a round black fuzz with, you would only see just her cotton paws and her kissy spot on her face. So start off adding some for the paws. And if it's in a teardrop shape, you can blend it up into your forms like this. Now remember, wherever you add clay, you have to make sure that you smooth down the clay so that it like it will blend into the clay and not just like sit there on the top. Because if you don't blend the clay in and it doesn't adhere properly, what's going to happen is that you're going to like maneuver it and it's just going to pop off. So you don't want that to happen. With traditional ceramics, you end up doing if you're going to add clay, you have to do a process called scoring and slit. So to add ceramics, you would go like this and score the surface of the clay, and then you put some water, and then you can rub it back and forth, and that's kind of the cheater way until it sticks. Or you take some slip and you bash it on top, and then you do it, and then that's how you do it. And that kind of that slip is kind of like a glue, and that scoring is like a tooth that will make it stick. The great thing about polymer clay is you don't have to do that. Sylvia says, as an artist, you make it look so easy. This is a relatively easy project. It does require a little bit of fiddling, every once in a while, but in theory, it's an easy project and anybody can do it, really. Now for the back paws, they're not going to be like off to the back. They're kind of going to be tucked under a little bit. So I roll a ball and then make a kind of a teardrop shape and then flatten it. And that's going to sit under here kind of like so. And that may not be the right proportions right now, but I can always add clay or subtract clay or do different things. Now you're going to notice I'm not going to be blending it completely like smooth. So far I've been blending it really smooth. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend it really smooth down here at the bottom. And this is going to make sure that the surface is nice and flat. And then I'm going to take my tool. I'm going to get up in those creases and press the clay up like this. And that's going to make sure that it's not going to come off and get messed up. But I do want there to be a defined line. So what you can also do is smooth it so that it adheres properly, and then cut a line in using this tool. And I'll show you that like this. All right. So, yeah. All right. Now, depending on if your cat has fluffy paws or if it has super, if it has like super skinny and well-defined paws, like if it's one of those Sphinx cats where you can see like all the muscles and everything, you'll take this side of your tool, which is a flat kind of side, and kind of go in and kind of make those indications that there's toes. And I'm just doing them real rough. I'm not necessarily rough, but more crudely. I'm not going to like go in there and really detail the heck out of it. All right. And then going back to the front paw, or actually we'll do the tail next. So I'm going to take some of this clay and I'm going to roll it into a coil. And I'm going to roll it into a coil. And I'm going to move this out of the way because I've done this where I've tried to do this on camera and then I've knocked this stuff and then it's fallen down and then gets all misshapen. So I'm not going to do that this time. I'm just going to pull this off to the side and work with it like this. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is, depending on if your cat has a thin tail or a bushy tail, or if it gets startled, you kind of make the shape of your tail according to your own particular cat, I guess. Now, if you want, you can always do an armature and embed a wire and embed that in the clay. I'm going to have this conform to my cat sculpture. So I'm going to attach this at the bottom where it would naturally go. I mean, if you want to get real detailed, you could probably get in there and make it super uh, anatomical. If you want to put a little bee hole, you could if you wanted to. William bought this pendant, and I didn't know what it was, and I don't know if he knew what it was either. But it was a cat bunghole, and I was like, "Did you know that that's what that was?" And he was like, "Ah." So, and I think he won in an auction. So I'm just gonna say that he didn't see the picture really close, because but yeah, you never know. Some people think that's charming. I saw this thing where you could buy cookie cutters, and it was of the cat butthole. Um, and yeah, that's a thing. I didn't know that's a thing, but I guess it is. Now, if you do anything kind of loosey goosey with this and it's all like in the air, you want to make sure you have an armature, because if you go like this and it's all like up here and there's nothing to support it, and you bake it and there's no support, this will, when it's in the oven, it will get soft and it will slowly go like this. And then you think you're having it, it's all like standing tall and proud, but it goes like this in the oven. And then you're like, oh, what happened? How come it looks sad? And so what I will do is sometimes if I want there to be like volume, like if I want there to be a more dynamic movement in the cattail where it's like up like that, I'll attach it here. And then that sometimes I'll do a little score. And if I need to, there's a thing called clay paste, and you can use that as a glue, where you can use this a dab of this liquid polymer, and a dab will do. Now this stuff never dries out unless it's baked. So this bottle can look supremely crusty, and just ignore that, because it can look terrible, but it's actually not, you know. Well, it actually is terrible because it's got all that hairs and whatever. And you just use that as a glue and just stick that on there. And when that bakes, that'll bake hard. So if you have to stick anything, you can do that. Also, you can use a little bit of that liquid polymer if you want to smooth any of the shapes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from behind and find the spine, which that's connected to, and make sure there's a ridge that runs. And that sounds weird, but it's those little tiny details, those little anatomical details, which will make your character a lot more. It will have a little bit more realism to it. It won't be like a. I'm not. I am by no stretch of the imagination trying to make this into like a 100% anatomically correct with all the detail kind of thing, but I do want those little tiny details that give the illusion of realism. So that way, even if it's a caricature, or kind of a gestural kind of thing, it will still be rooted in reality, and people will buy it more. They'll say, "Oh, I get it. I know what that is." All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start working on some of the details. So what I'm going to do here is I've got this little ball of clay, and I'm going to squash it into the form of like a triangle shape, like so. And it's little itty bitty, and I'm going to place that right at the tip of the nose. And I'm going to take my tool. I'm going to use the scoop end of that tool, and I'm going to smooth this in like so. And then I'm going to smooth this in and attach it like so. If you want to use a little bit of clay paste, you can use a little bit of clay paste. I'm generally too lazy, and after I work with this, it will naturally it will be fine. Don't worry about it. All right. And right now it looks kind of weird, but I'm going to take and make 2 more little balls. And these ones I do want to have be relatively the same size. All right. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this and butt it up against that triangle of the nose and just kind of loosely tack it in place with my fingertips, like so. All right. And then I'm going to take this tool and smooth it down. Now, I don't want to smooth this down completely and erase all of that kind of division of work. Not yet, anyways. But I do want that to remain more obvious. But I will get in there, and it helps to have a finer tool. But you can get in there and just smooth this down, and that will help make that little muzzle, the little cheek meat. And I want to make sure that I'm going to make sure that it's completely smoothed down, like so. All right. And I'm not going to get I'm not going to polish it super smooth just yet because I'm going to add one more little ball. And this one is going to be slightly smaller than the muzzle mouth balls that you made before. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this ball and then squish it on one side, and that's going to flatten that one side like that, okay? And that is going to be the little chin. And you can see it's already shaping up. Now, depending on your cat that you're making, will depend how big you make the little muzzle mouth. It will depend if you have like whisker, like the shape of the cat's head. Like Gilbert, he's getting a little bit of a beard, so he would have a little bit more here, a little bit more fuller on the side of the face. And if you're going to do that, you can always just take this and then add it here. Add that little cheek meat in there, that side cheek meat, his little beard. Or Babette, she had a very round face when she was younger, and then as she got older, her face kind of thinned out. So again, look at your references, and that will help as well. But I'm just going to add this to add a little bit more definition to the face so that it kind of looks more like a head. All right. So here we go. I've added some of that little beard flesh, little fluff, and then I'm going to round it out because I want this to be a little bit rounder. And I'm going to flatten this out a little bit so that it's a little bit not super pronounced. All right. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make eyelids. And to make eyelids, you have to roll coils out and then apply them on there. All right. So just roll coils out, roll coils out, roll coils out. And then you'll apply this. And the other nice thing about applying the eyelids is that it will help keep your eye from popping out. And so I'm just going to go and just attach one side of that, really attach that one side uh, at the top of this. And what that's going to do is it's going to leave that kind of rolled edge for the upper lid. And then I just will add the bottom lid. Now, if you're, sometimes it helps to put this all the way like this to overlap it and then just pinch it off. And if there's excess here, you can pinch that off like that and smooth the lower lid. And like I said, not only is this an aesthetic choice, but you can also, it will also help keep your glass eyes from popping out. The glass is not going to want to stick to it. It's like the ceramic. It's not going to want to stick to it. You can embed stuff, but if you don't have something that's going to hold it in place, it's going to pop out. And that's not the end of the world. You can always glue it in place afterwards. But if you add just this little coil of clay, that little snake of clay, it will help dramatically. And you don't have to then go and glue stuff and mess around with that. You can just have it be done with it. You know, and this also, you can use that as an opportunity to add details. All right. So I just smoothed out the clay. And the thing that you'll want to try to do is make sure that as you're smoothing out the upper, you'll then do the bottom too. And the nice thing about looking at photos is you can get a lot of expression um, from them, from the eyes in particular. And I just trim my nails, but sometimes I'll just use my fingernail to trim off extra clay. And so for me, I like to have kind of a gestural style. Like the body and stuff is going to be super loose, but there'll be little points that are a little bit more realistic. And I think that that kind of is fun. That's like a fun juxtaposition of stylized kind of looks. And now, depending on how you want to do this, like especially dogs have this a lot when you're sculpting dogs, but they have these little bumps over their eyes. That's like their eyebrow, and they can be very expressive. Now, cats, they have it too, but at least not as much as dogs. So you kind of have to be careful adding too much. But I just make a little ball and then put it on there like so, and it will give that illusion of that kind of eyebrow whisker mound. You know what I'm talking about? Wherever there's kind of whiskers that poke out like their eyebrows, they have like a little mound where they're stuck out of. And that can you can play a lot with that to get that kind of expression. So if you make it super round, you can make it look sad or happy. The shape of the eye, if you make it very round, it will look surprised. So just play around with that, and you can get those little touches of realism without going too aggressive into it. All right, so I'm gonna add this eyebrow mound on this side. And yeah, I'm going to add that to the side, blending those edges down. And I'm not being super like precise. Like I am taking my time, but I'm not like going in and finessing each little mound of flesh or clay that's to simulate flesh. And you definitely 100% could. There are some amazing ceramicists. There's one Beth Carver. She really goes in, and it's like she puts every single muscle that is on a creature. So she does these phenomenal hairs, and that's HARES, not hairs HAIRS. But she does these phenomenal rabbits where each of the muscles are like super well defined, and she gets a lot of expression from it. There's a show that's up at Touchstone right now, and Zuzu, I can't remember the first name, but the art, I shared it in my stories or reels or whatever when I was there at the board meeting, and they did a really wonderful job getting that kind of uh, caricature or the musculature in there. All right, so we've got the eyebrows, we've got the muzzle. I like to take this little sharp point and really make the muzzle or the nose holes pronounced. I do that a little aggressively, and that's whenever I paint these. That will get kind of trapped in those holes, and it will look a little bit more pronounced, because when you fill in and when you paint these, you're adding a layer on top, so it's going to fill in some of those details. So whenever I'm sculpting animals like this, I'm a little bit aggressive with the mark making I do, because the paint will cover up some of that. All right, and putting this in there, and I'm gonna wobble that right there like this, and that's gonna make it look like it's smiling. And then I'm gonna get this one, which is a little bit more pointy, and I'm gonna stab it and make it where the whiskers would come out. And those, again, I'm being more aggressive than they're not actually that deep in real life. Um, And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to make like a V shape in this. And then that's going to be the ears. All right. So they kind of have very thin ears. You don't necessarily want to make them as thin as they actually are in real life, because then they can just break right off. And then, that's not great. But you also fold them in if you want, and change the shape of the ears. Depending on your cat, they may be more on the side of the head, or they'll be more up to the top. It just depends on the type of cat, and you're the cat that you're trying to make. Some cats have rounder ears, I've noticed, and they're not completely just like little triangles, but they have a little bit more roundness to them. So again, that's where looking at pictures can help. All right, so the other trick is, when you get your tool, go in the corner and stab. And the other thing that is good is if you have a sharp tool like this, like a needle tool, you can stab into the armature, and you can hear it because it will kind of make a kind of, and you're like, why is he stabbing the cat's eye like that? And the reason why is I'm creating vents in case the air needs to escape. It can go into the out of those holes, and it won't balloon up the clay. It will come out the holes that I've created. All right. I'm going to smooth that over so it's not quite as quizzical looking. All right. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the paws real fast, and then I'm going to show you texturing. So I'm going to make these little balls and stick them on to the clay. And really, you don't have to get too particular about them because you're going to want to have enough room to blend the edges down. So I'm actually going to make these fairly large. And as I'm working, I'm kind of cleaning up as I go by picking up some of those little giblets. And then, see, I almost knocked it down. The other thing that I like to do periodically is turn my sculpture around and look at it from different angles. So when you do that, if you're looking at it like this, looks fine, right? It's nicely blended on all the sides. Yeah, no problem, right? Then you go around like this and you see this where it wasn't blended. So blend that down, smooth it out. And like this on the back, you can see it. There's a flap there. You can smooth that. There's a little crease here. You can always smooth that. And there you go. Now I'm going to attach these. So I'm going to roll this out on both sides. It's going to make kind of like a crescent that's not crescent, but like crescent roll, and fit it on. It almost looks like shoes. And I probably could have done this earlier in my sculpt. And then I'm just going to smooth this up and attach it like so. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I've already kind of roughly smoothed this. I'm going to take this tool and go like this, and it's going to define the paws. And if you want, you can go and detail them even more, but that's good for me for right now. All right, so there's a little swell on the chest, or at least on my cats there is. So it's not completely like concave. So I'm just gonna add that, and that's like a little heart shape. It's like a little heart-shaped mound. And in theory, if you wanted to, you could do this in colored clay as you're working and not paint it. And you would do it the same way, just adding little bits of clay as you go. And I'll make the little shoulders. And there you go. So this is, it's not done by any stretch of the imagination, but the next part is kind of the texturing part, at least for the sculpting that I do. And so I will take this tool, and you want to get the flattest part of it, and you just kind of go in there and you make these marks like so. And again, I'm working a little bit deeper than I normally would. And that's because when the paint sits in it, it will cling to those kind of crevices and that's where those details kind of really pop. And I like to make the fur kind of all in one kind of, you kind of work with the forms of the the animal. So if you're doing arms and stuff, you're not going to go across like this, because if you go across like this, it's not flowing with the natural kind of form of the animal. Now, if you do want to build in stripes, for example, into your build, you would go and you would do them much more densely across and then more sparse, and you'd leave a gap in between. So more densely and then more sparse. And then that kind of tricks the eye. When you paint it, it will trick the eye into to looking like stripes. But if you want them to be all kind of one color, then you go over and you overlap this texture. All right. And you just go all the way around. Now, the thing is, the tricky part is it's better to work on one kind of section and move around, as opposed to working a little here, then working a little there, then working here, then working there. And the reason why is that you're going to be flattening out your texture as you go if you do that. So just keep that in mind, because if you start gripping on this real tight, it's going to smash that down. Now, there are things that you can do. Um, like if you are really interested in adding texture and it's like a super pain in the butt texture, like scales, you can do the musculature of your sculpture first and bake that, and then go back over and do a thin scrim or layer of clay, and then use that, and without to form your scales. And what that will do is you'll have the same form, and it won't get kind of messed up with um, it won't get messed up with like you pressing on it super hard. So it will look right, it will still have its like form, that you won't be kind of compressing as you're adding texture, or you'll get kind of like it all go in one side, and look kind of weird. Now, of course, I should also preface this by saying that I sculpt, but I'm definitely not like Cynthia. She is a much more, um, she sculpts way better than I do. Mine is more gestural and more loose than her flavor. So, if you want to learn how to she sculpts, it's a little bit different than the way that I do it. Um, And what I did just now, if you didn't notice what I just did, it because I kind of just did it without talking about it, was I made that lip. So I went over here and I went like that, and it kind of adds that little definition of the face, of the mouth. But I still want that. If you get wherever that kind of separation that you're after gets kind of muddled, you can always take a sharp kind of flat tool and kind of carve out um those lines in case you need to. All right. So I'm just going to add texture, keep adding texture. And let's see. I see Cynthia says Marty has little rounded ears. Yeah, her cat has a British short hair. Our little boys, I don't know if they have a little bit something feral in their bloodline, but they have little tufts on their ears. And I noticed not all cats have that. Like Babette did not have little tufts on her ears. So somewhere in there, there's a little bit of something wild. Um, Abby says, "Wow, last I looked, it was a ball of clay and a crumple of foil, and now it's a realistic cat. Amazing. Thanks." Um, Facebook user or Marianne says, "I love this little kitty." Facebook user says, "Adorable." Nancy says, "Wow." Um, Eddie says, "This is marvelous." Joyce says, "I love these intricate details." I like that these. For me, it's a very meditative thing, and I know not everybody's into that. Um, and they're not everybody is into like the texture, like the super duper texture. Sometimes, like with my paintings, like when I was painting Paolo, I really like added tons of brushwork to his hair, and it made it look less realistic than if I kind of blocked out the hair and kind of did a little bit of stippling here and a little bit of this. But there's just something about that kind of mindful repetition of motions. And I like to think about, like, whenever I'm doing this kind of thing about a specific cat, I think about that. And it's a good time to reflect and think about um things, life, your lives together. Particularly if you're making this as like a memorial piece. Now, this one doesn't look like Babette. Um, Not really. And I could probably try to make it, but I don't think I'm ready yet. Like with Paolo, it took a couple days for me to get that painting ready for William. I made a painting for William of Paolo after, and it took a little bit of time to like paint it out. And not because the painting itself took a long time to paint, but I think sometimes you just have to have that time to process. And um, in some ways it feels like she's not even gone yet. um, and I don't want to talk too much about it because it's hard to sculpt when you're like bawling your eyes out. But in So anyways, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get kind of used to the fact that they're not with you and physically anymore. At least that's in my experience. And I was talking to Marianne earlier about writing a post, and I didn't want to write the post until after the live because it was making me a little bit emotional thinking about it. But this morning, when William fed the cats, they had left. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to say this without crying, but they had left a little bit of food for Babette, and they all share the same plate. And it just broke my heart because the cats, Gilbert and Barnaby, are it's like me and William have definitely lost Babette, but so have they. So like I was when I saw that, I was just like a mess because that they like to share because all of their lives they've been forced to share food, and then like now they're going to save some for Babette. And usually she would eat first too because she was the alpha. And so Gilbert, he like last night he's kind of starving his butt off because he's waiting for Babette because he always kind of eats last. And and you know it was just hard to see that. Anyway, so you're just gonna want to keep adding texture and go in the direction of the fur And you can be as precise or as gestural as you want. Remember, as your fingers go over it, um, it will um, it will flatten out that texture. So just be mindful not to go too much. And then whenever there's like a shadow, like a natural shadow, like you may want to go a little bit extra in those areas where there's a natural shadow. And the reason why I do that is because the paint, like I said, will want to stick in those areas more if there's more texture. So you'll be building in a shadow in those recessed areas. Now the other thing about that is you can change the direction of the strokes, and that will also change up that kind of where the paint sticks. So if I want this to be a little bit more curvature like this, so far I've been going like this, but if I just change it subtly, it will, once there's paint kind of smeared in there, it will look different. Um, and so, yeah. Michelle says, I have painted items like this. It's great to see how they started. Yeah, so this is how I sculpt. I mean, um, usually I'm a lot quicker when I'm sculpting cats. Like I can sculpt cats in my sleep, especially like this. But when I'm kind of demonstrating, it takes a little bit longer. And like I said, you'll have to turn your piece around and then really get in to some of those nooks and crannies, because sometimes that's where you'll miss spots for the texture. And if you want to texture the bottom, you can texture the bottom. I generally don't, because if I bake this on the ceramic tile, sometimes that ceramic tile will cling to the surface, and when it bakes it will kind of have a glassy smooth kind of finish. So if you do a bunch of detail there, it will just get ruined anyway. So unless you do it like really deep, so that's up to you if you want to texture all the way around. I think it's also people don't necessarily look at the bottom, so again, that's like up to you as far as your like texturing. Now, what I'm gonna do once I finish adding the texture, I'm gonna look around it again and do a 360 and make sure that I textured everywhere that I want to, and that I'm texturing as deeply as I want to in the certain areas. Um, And they also have tools, and you can make these or do whatever. And they you can make more strokes than just one, because I'm doing one at a time now, and it can kind of be repetitive, and sometimes that's not great. Now there's another trick, and I don't know if I brought one or have one here. Um, but you can also use a toothbrush for really fine details. So what I'm going to do is, after I finish this, adding the big kind of swathes of detail, I'm going to look for that toothbrush, and In theory, I have a bunch, but I can't find it, so I'm not going to worry about it. But another thing you can do is when you have this like this, you can take a needle and also use that to texture. And that will give another texture for it. So there's a lot of different things that you can use to texture the surface. And if you have like a brush with really stiff bristles, like say, like you definitely are not going to use this brush for anything else if you get polymer clay in it. But if you have a brush that's got really stiff bristles like this is one that I tried to clean but didn't get to do a good job. But you can use that also to scratch the surface and make it a little bit more. It's a subtle texture. You're not getting that kind of that deep gouging as you did with the other tools, but this is a way you can add a more matte finish so that there isn't like shiny parts. All right. So when you go to bake this, you have to bake this. And another thing I should say is if you don't, there are people, some people like they like to sculpt with what's called a clay shaper, and it's like a rubber tip. So if you like that flavor, you can do that also. Now, the other thing you can do if you have a super kind of stiff bristle is go in there and stipple it. And that will also add a texture. Really just get some clay and look around your house or whatever and find different tools that you can play around with and do some mark making. And I think that that kind of really helps. And you can find different tools that way that you may not have done otherwise. You know, like a toothbrush. You know, you may not have be thinking of that exactly as a sculpting tool, but there you go. All right, so I'm nearly done. I'm just going to sign this real fast. And date it. And then if there's giblets, I just kind of knock the giblets off. And there you go. So whenever I go to bake this, I'm going to bake this at 275, and I'm going to bake it for 15 minutes per quarter-inch depth. So when you do the math on this, maybe you're smarter than me and can know exactly how deep everything is and how whatever you did, but you're gonna. I would probably bake this for like 45 minutes to an hour. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a little tent, and it's going to fit over this sculpture. And I'm not going to throw the aluminum foil when I'm done with it. I'm just going to, I can reuse that and make an armature out of it, or use it again for the as another tent for another sculpture. Sometimes it'll kind of lose its crinkliness if you like crinkle it up and uncrinkle it and recrinkle it and uncrinkle it and back and forth. It'll kind of get kind of limp noodle style, which is not great if you want it to stick up. But you just want to make sure that it's not touching your piece. So and if it is touching, that it's not touching like hard. And then you put this in the oven, and then it will, what happens when it off cooks, or off gas, when it cooks and cures in the oven, it will off gas, and those off gases will stick to the inside of the aluminum foil hat as opposed to the inside of the oven. Now, invariably, some will get and stick to the inside of the oven, but it's not the end of the world. It's just that when you heat up your oven, it won't smell as funky. So just keep that in mind. So let's see. Anybody else have head pins when you can't find a needle? LOL. That's what I used. I couldn't find one, so I used that. And Helen's watching. I need to email Helen. I'll do that right after I get off of the thing. And then when you clean up your hands, because right now I've worked with the polymer a lot, I'm going to use a baby wipe and clean my hands. I'm also going to clean the surface of this table after I'm done with a baby wipe, and that will help clear up any of that excess residue. All right. So I'm going to bake this, and then tomorrow or whenever I have a chance to paint it, I will show you what it looks like when it's painted. But I have chores to do, so I can't stay and hang out. And plus, this takes like an hour to bake. So hopefully you had fun. June said thank you for the demo and the many tips. Yeah, I kind of feel like with these, since we don't have a time constraint, sometimes with a GBE, we only have an hour for our presentations, and some of these things, like I remember I did a demo on enameling, and we just like breezed through it in less than an hour, and then talked about kits and everything else. But you could spend like hours and hours and hours going through like the fine details of certain subject. So one thing that's nice about the takeover days is that it affords us the opportunity and extra time to go in as in depth as we want to or not. I should also mention that the Midsummer Market is coming up soon. That is, I don't have the dates in front of me, but it's like the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. You don't quote me on that. You'll have to double check. We are going to be doing the preview party on that Friday night. And then on Saturday morning, we're going to be doing our presentation. And if Cynthia is still here, she might still be here. She'll be hanging out and doing her presentation that Sunday, I believe. So we'll have fun, and probably we'll maybe sneak a after party in or something. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Marion says it was fascinating. Michelle said a regular oven. Yeah, you want to have something that has even heat. If you have an older oven, one thing you can do to test if your heat is even is you can take some shaved coconut, and fill a baking pan or baking sheet and sprinkle it all across the bottom. And you can see the hot spots of where your oven is. So if you have a hot spot and it like scorches in that one spot, don't put your sculpture in that spot, or make sure that it's covered and protected. All ovens are different. So sometimes it's good to have an oven thermometer, especially if you're using an oven that you haven't used before, because sometimes they will be very hot and then get kind of cool, or some of them have an even consistent heat, and you kind of have to judge how to adjust the temperature. Sometimes if your oven is if it is lower in temperature, even though it says it's a certain thing on the knob, sometimes if you adjust it so that it's over fire it, you can kind of get that kind of middle spot. Or if you put it to, if your oven is really hot and is super hot, you can kind of set it a little bit lower, and that will get the right temperature. So it's 275, and depending on the clay that you use, it will determine how long you have to bake it. So I worked with one clay, and it had I want to say that it was the beeswax clay, but there was one clay that we ended up. It was like a super low temperature um, that you had to bake it at. And I forgot, and I put it on a higher temperature, and it kind of turned crispy. Um, and so you just have to make sure you follow your manufacturer's instructions and use clays that are compatible when you mix them. Now, the other thing about firing that I can think of is if you um, are going to do a lot of polymer clay, having a dedicated oven is super great because you can use that. Now, I have a little toaster oven and I'm going to use that. I've set it for 275. I've let it preheat, and I'm going to bake it in the preheated toaster oven at 275. Now, I saw somebody that I really admire. They just started from a cold oven and they just went and turned it on and they factor that into it. Um, and I had noticed their pieces weren't fully hardening. And then I kind of realized that they weren't getting their pieces up to temperature. Um, and I guess one of the things that is also something to consider is that if you work in stages, so if you do like a ball and then you build on top of that ball, you may want to bake the ball first, and you can bake it for a lower temperature and for less time, and then add more and then bake that. And every time you bake it, it's going to be cured a little bit longer and cured a little bit longer. So you can kind of par bake things too if you're trying to build up layers. So it just depends. With this, it's going to go in for 275, be tented with aluminum foil, and I'm going to cook it for between 45 minutes and an hour. And then when I cool it, I'm going to let it cool slowly by taking it out or turning off the oven and letting it kind of cool slowly. If you cool it too quickly, you can shock it and it can crack. So, just like regular clay, it's a thermal shock that you can cause. Sometimes that's good though. Sometimes you need to do that to fix stuff, but that's a different thing. And I'm not going to get into that because that's a troubleshooting if you have cracks already and you need to like repair certain things. But anyways, I digress. Um, Eileen says, "Thanks, Andrew Thornton. This was a fun demo. I'm glad you liked it." Amanda says, "Do you leave your pieces in the oven to cool down, or do you take them out right away?" I take them out generally, especially because the longer you leave them in, the longer they kind of have a chance to get messed up. Um, but I've seen people leave them in and then like when they're done they like crack the door open to let the heat out. I think that that's asking for trouble, but you kind of have to make sure that you're not overdoing it, but you definitely don't want to underdo it, but you also don't want to overdo it and have it be super scorched. um, and if it does get scorched, just paint over it, so that's not the end of the world. Um, Eileen says, "I've burnt my clay before. Luckily, it was fall leaves." Well, you can always paint over it too. And you can, it's a good, I think sometimes it can even work in your favor. One time, me and Cynthia, we taught a class in Port Townsend, and the only oven that they had was these old ovens in the officers' barracks. And there was one student, and she was from Australia, and she was cool, but she was having a lot of hard times. Um, like it just was a challenge for her, and at times. And of course, she brought this weird brand of clay that was, I'd never heard of it, but I think it was like some kind of Australian off brand clay. And all of the stuff was in a different, was in Celsius instead of Fahrenheit, I think. So I didn't know. And apparently it cooked at a lower temperature. And she had one, and of all the pieces to get kind of crispy, it was hers. And at first I was like, crap, the student that like needed the biggest win uh ended up getting kind of kicked while they're down. And I was like, this is terrible. But the thing is, in her piece, when it got crispy, it got crispy. It was like black all over. um but the thing is then we did like a chiaroscuro thing where we built up layers of paint on top of it. And the black, actually, when you want something to be really luminous, you'll start with a black background and build up those layers. And her piece turned out phenomenal. It was like so awesome. And then one of the other students was like, I wish I burnt my piece. And she was just joking, but yeah, that sometimes that's a happy accident that happened. But it's not completely ruined. Now I have burned things to the point where they're like bubbly and smoking and cracked and not great. It was accidentally sent for like roasting vegetables instead of I was working on a big piece, and yeah, that piece had to go in the trash. But um, otherwise, you can salvage things. And I think part of what I enjoy about polymer clay is that it is surprisingly resilient, and also it's a great mimicker. I don't know if that's a real word, mimicker. It's a great mimic of the craft world. And you can get it to look almost like anything. So if you want it to look like stone, you can make things that look like stone and paint them, and you would think like it was a stone. You can get things, and nowadays they have lots of like translucent clays, so you can do things that were formerly kind of hard to capture that internal light or whatever, and kind of mimic it. So there's a lot of potential with polymer clay as a versatile medium, and I think it's a relatively accessible thing. You can spend about $100 and get a basic kind of setup. You can spend like $4 and get the most basic setup as long as you have an oven. And even then, you can find them at the Goodwill or thrift store for relatively inexpensive. That one you do have to get an oven thermometer just to check. But polymer clay, you can get everything that you need relatively inexpensively. So there's a lot of accessibility into that, and you can make it look almost like anything. There are some things that you will will be harder to mimic, like polished metal is trickier, but then you can get the foils out and mess with that and embed that and use super metallic paints and different things like that. Yeah, but you know, it really is something where you can have to play with it and kind of figure out what works best for your style and what you want to achieve. Um, Now, polymer does have its limitations, as with all materials. Sometimes, like it's not as strong as some of the other clays out there. You kind of have to live with that. Um, and sometimes it's not as grippy. So if you're going to do like a mosaic piece and you try to do that like you would do it in epoxy clay, the same way with polymer, unless you have like a lip, it's just not going to work the same way. And those, your little mosaic's going to be popping things out like popcorn. Um, so just keep that in mind. You know, there are certain drawbacks. Sometimes things are easier to break with polymer. So you do have to have armatures if you're going to do it. Um, but it does come in a wide variety of colors, and you can mimic a lot of textures and techniques. So really, I love polymer, and I hope you love it too, and that you enjoyed our time today together. All right. I'm going to sign out. I'm not going to flip the camera around. So I see there's a couple more comments. Michelle says, this was great. Lots of information. Diane says, so satisfying to watch you create. Great talent. Thanks for sharing. Suzanne says, so cute. All right. And Facebook user says, thanks, Andrew. You're so awesome. Well, thank you. You're awesome too, even though I don't know who that is, but thank you. All right. I will talk to you all later. I don't know if we're going to go on tonight. Helen's supposed to come over and we're going to do some soldering tomorrow. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to have time to do another live tonight. I was going to maybe do painting, but I don't think I'm going to have time to do that tonight because it's probably already getting pretty late and I haven't eaten yet. And we still have the house to clean. So probably not. William will have more posts coming out, and we'll be sharing some more stories the rest of the evening up until midnight. We are the last presenters of the Great Beat Extravaganza Takeover leading up to Midsummer Market in just a few weeks. We are super excited for that. We originally tried to do a bunch of kits that we were going to sell at the same time um, for a midsummer market. But with Babette being sick, and then when she passed, it kind of derailed a lot of those plans. So we are going to launch a kit sometime this weekend. Whether or not it gets to you in time, I don't know. I don't know if it will. If it doesn't get to you, it'll probably be kind of mystery style kit. But part of that we will hang out and make stuff from using that kit. All right. So hopefully you all will pick that up. Please enjoy the coupon. The coupon will go until Friday night at 11:59, and then it will be done. So if you want to save 15%, use coupon code TAKEOVER at allegorygallery.com. It's only good for online only, and also it does not include the fine pewter from AG, and it does not include any trunk shows that we have currently. So if you just keep that in mind, because I know some people were like, oh, I might use it for this, this, and this. And I was like, well, if you do, you're only going to get like 50 cents off, and then you're going to be surprised because it will only take off on certain categories and not on others. So just keep that in mind. We are catching up on shipping. We were delayed for a couple days. So keep that in mind also. So if you are waiting for an order, just hold off writing us because we're playing catch up right now. But we will be, hopefully, we will be soon. We'll be caught up in the next few days in time for us to launch the next kit. And then for when Cynthia comes, because then we're going to have lots of kids. All right. I'm going to go for real this time. All right. Have a great night. And I wanted to say thank you for all of your kind words and all of your heartfelt gestures. It really means a lot to me and William and our little family. It's been a really hard time lately, and we were very close to not doing anything for Takeover. But I'm glad we can kind of pull it together. Um, and get something for y'all because I enjoy these. I hope you enjoy them as well. All right. Have a good night. I will talk to you later. See ya.